All right, good morning. I suspect we'll get a few more stragglers in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Mike Klabmeyer. I'm the Associate Vice President here at Hamilton College for Facilities and Campus Planning. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here for this first event in Hamilton's 2025-26 Arboretum Speaker Series. I'm delighted to kick things off today. And I hope that you'll mark your calendars. Our next event is the 1st of November, which happens to coincide with our parents' weekend. All right, so just keep a lookout. Our website has all the details. Hope to see you back. And since it's homecoming weekend, anybody here an alum from Hamilton or Kirkland? I suspect they're at all the other programming that's going on campus as we speak. It was my honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Fred Breglia. Fred is the executive director of the Landis Arboretum in Esperance, New York, where he has dedicated nearly 3 decades to stewardship, education, and community engagement. He's a certified arborist, and he is widely recognized for his expertise in pruning, planting, and mulching, things that we will learn more about today. Knowledge he shares generously with both professionals and homeowners alike. Many of Fred's fans know him as the Tree Man, a frequent guest of the Albany area WAMC's Vox Pop radio show, or as a passionate big tree hunter. He's traveled the world in search of some of the largest and oldest trees. I hope we get to see some photos of those exploits today, maybe?
Maybe.
Okay, great. Have you seen our Norway spruce here in our lab?
Yeah, actually, it was originally the guy who nominated it.
Yeah?
It was a national champion at one.
That's right.
Yep, and New York now no longer recognizes trees that are not native to the United States. So the Norway is no longer listed, but it, to our knowledge, is still one of the biggest documented
Good.
Norways that
All
we
right.
know of. And you guys used to also have the largest white poplar that was in the nation, and that one was a native. But it was, unfortunately, it came down somewhere outside the science building.
Yeah.
Years ago. I do have a picture of it, not in this presentation.
Okay.
Not even on digital.
Yeah. Gotcha.
On old 35 millimeter
Okay.
print, but it was a beast of a tree.
Well,
You guys definitely got some great trees here.
yeah, we sure do. Great trees, and we've got some trees in training to become champion trees today.
Great.
So absolutely. So Fred's work reflects a deep belief that awareness and appreciation of trees leads to conservation, a value that resonates strongly with all of us here at Hamilton that hold our arboretum so dear, because it is really an integral part of what enables the sense of place that is so uniquely Hamilton. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Fred.
Well, thank you all for coming out. Great to be here. Always pleasure to talk about trees. I never get tired of this stuff. Been doing it for a really long time. Started really young, so that's why I look as good as I do. I will ask you just to silence your phones. Flash photography is still up. The jokes aren't going to get any better, folks, so bear with me on this. We're going to talk about the latest in plant healthcare today, pruning, planting, mulching. The main part of this is with the most meat on the bone, I guess you'd say, is the pruning piece. So we're going to start with that first. I'll ask you to hold the questions to the end if you can, and hoping to sort of leave about 10 minutes or so at the end to answer those questions. Just a real quick plug for the Landis Arboretum. Started back in 1951. We have hundreds of acres. 40 of those acres are what we call formal collections, trees and shrubs from all different parts of the world. We have 2 old growth forests on site that are preserved. They're recognized by the Old Growth Forest Network, and you'll see signs, and we have interpretive material out in the woods when you take those hikes. We have a complete New York State native plant collection with virtually every woody plant growing on about a 1-mile trail. We're nationally recognized through the American Public Garden Association for our northeastern oak collection, where we've been conserving. Great place to see birds, not just bluebirds, but all kinds of birds. We have a great birding site. We are one of the best places, I like to say, for the public to see the New York State native bluebird, just because we have an incredible site. We put out every year, there's like 40 or 50 new baby bluebirds that go out around the Arboretum, and a lot of them do overwinter. A year-round calendar of events. We have a live music venue. We're a great place. We've been doing a lot of weddings. We've sort of gotten to the wedding business just because we started renting out our facility and it's become popular. And that helps to keep us growing and helps keep the mission of the Arboretum strong as well. And we're located in Esperance, New York. It took me about an hour to get here today, so a little over an hour. LandisArboretum.org, our website, is probably our best marketing tool. When kind of a one-stop shop for all things Landis. We are also on Facebook, so if you're Facebookers, we're on Facebook as well, and we're also on Instagram. And we did mention a little bit about the big tree stuff I do. So if you do want to see more about that, I run an Instagram account called Big Tree Hunters, and it's taken off. It's, you know, I guess it's grown, and we're over 300,000 people followers on that today. I think it's 310,000 now. And I also run a page on Facebook, Ancient Forest and Champion Trees, and that one's over 300,000 people as well. That's almost close to 400,000. So follow me along on those groups and those platforms. We also started a group called Big Tree Seekers on Facebook too. So if you're someone that wants to see more big trees, can't get enough of this stuff, no pressure. Any of those accounts you're going to see. And the Big Tree Seekers group is set up for people to post. So if you find trees in your own neighborhood, you can post them. And it doesn't have to be the world's biggest tree. It could be whatever's big, you know, it's your big tree, wherever it means to you. And around here, there's no shortage of them. So, all right. We do some hands-on printing classes at Landis Arboretum. We did one this year. I do one every year. So if you ever want to get more hands-on, come visit us. Like I said, we're not too far away, and the Arboretum's looking better all the time. We've been doing a lot of work, getting a lot of grants, and putting those grants to work. And you can see it from year to year. Our infrastructure, our plant collections, our overall trail systems, they're looking better all the time, and people are noticing it. And when you get grants and you let the granting agencies know what you're doing, and you see that firsthand, it makes you more favorable to get more grants. And we, you know, knock on wood, we've been doing really well. Thanks to my wife on that one as well. So no handouts for this talk. Most of the information is all on treesaregood.org, and it's put out by the International Society of Arboriculture. And it's a consumer-based website, so you can just go there and get all the kind of info you need. So most of the stuff is, you know, more or less on there, plus a whole bunch more. So pruning is generally considered one of the most, I'd say, routine maintenance procedures that we do on plants. You know, a lot of people feel like it's spring or it's summer and it's time for me to prune, but we always say you really kind of need to have a reason to prune, because even though I might be a professional arborist making a really exact cut on a tree, it's still an injury on the tree. So every pruning cut is an injury, and I'm going to, you know, sort of show you that. That doesn't mean don't prune. It just means let's have some reasons for pruning. And just because it's spring and the weather's nice, that's not a valid reason to go out and start pruning plants. So here's just a handful of examples. Failure reduction, clearances, improving aesthetics. Those are all reasons. Maintaining health. Trees that are pruned, shrubs that are pruned correctly they're going to be healthier. To reduce size, sometimes things are getting too big. That's a reason to prune. Increase light penetration, and also influence flower and fruit production. So you're going to get more fruit, more flowers off plants that are pruned correctly at the right time of year. It all starts with what we call the branch collar. So, and this applies to all woody plants. It's not just trees. This is doesn't matter how small the shrub is or how big the tree is. Any woody plant, everything we talk about here is all going to directly apply to that. So it all comes down to basically the branch collar. The branch collar is sort of a special little zone on woody plants where it does a lot of different things. It helps to seal wounds. So trees and woody plants don't actually heal like humans. There's a lot of comparisons to people, and I'll make comparisons to plants and people a lot. So there's a lot of similarities between plants and people, but there's a lot of differences too. And one of the differences is that when we get cut, theoretically, we heal. And when a tree gets cut, it never heals, it seals, so it closes over. And that branch collar is a big part of the sealing component of the woody plant. That's where a wound wood is produced. So the cut starts at the branch collar. And you kind of see the line there, that's where you would make the cut. And the goal is to cut as close to the branch collar without actually hitting the branch collar. It doesn't matter if it's a small branch or a large branch, we still have those collars. I will say that the smaller the branch is, the easier it is to make an accurate cut, and also the less, I guess you could say, the more tolerant the tree or shrub would be if you made an incorrect cut. So if we're cutting something off the size of a pencil and you got a little too close to the collar or left it a little too long as a stub, tree or shrub would deal with that. But on a large branch, you need to be more precise. So the larger the cut, the more precise you gotta be, but it all comes down to the branch collar. And on larger branches, we do something called a 3-point pruning cut. We remove the weight and then we come in and cut that last little part off next to the branch collar. Here you can see kind of a real life example. We have, you can see the collar clearly labeled. The branch comes in, and then on the right side, you can see made some lines there, yes and no. So the yes is kind of where we want to make the cut. Generally speaking, if the branch is coming in, we cut perpendicular to the branch. And but no two collars are exactly the same. No two branches are exactly the same. So you do got to kind of look at each one case by case. And on a small tree like this, it's a matter of identifying the branch, collar, and cut. Simple. On a larger branch, we mentioned the 3-point pruning cut. So cut 1 basically is an undercut, and that prevents bark stripping when you make cut 2, which removes the entire branch. And that's just to get the weight off. Because if you try to make the final cut 3 on a branch that's kind of heavy, it's going to want to pull down, and when it does that, it's going to want to tear. And if it tears the collar, you've now torn away some of the ability of that plant to seal. You can see here, identified undercut, 2 takes the weight off, 3 cuts as close to that collar as we can without hitting the collar. If you had to err on one side or the other, it would be better to err on the outside of the collar, because we can always come back and cut it a little closer. But if you took the collar off, we can't really glue that collar back on. And you can see the 3-point pruning cut here in action. And the final cut's being done right now, making that collar cut. So when we do that, we're not just looking at the collar, which is important. We're also looking at this branch bark ridge, which is above the collar. And that's also considered kind of part of the collar region of the woody plant. So we want to make sure we retain that branch bark ridge. Very, very important for sealing wounds. I will also say that collars sometimes are generally, well, in general, they're close to the, usually close to the main trunk or close to the main branch when you're taking off a smaller branch from a main branch. But sometimes when a piece of dead wood has stayed on a shrub or tree for a long period of time, the collar is actually growing out because its goal is actually to try to close that off. And that dead stub is actually kind of acting almost like a cork in a bottle. And it's preventing it from literally closing it off. So the collar is starting to grow out more along that dead branch. So do pay attention to that in cases where a dead branch has been left on a tree or shrub for an extended amount of time. The collar will grow out. And once you make that collar cut, then the tree can close it over. And once it closes its wound over, then no more energy goes to wound production. It goes back to normal physiological functions, which is transport, moving material up to the tree, storage for future leaf out after the dormant season, etc. All these pruning paints, wound dressings, all these clever marketing names that they've come up with, these products have all been proven to not work. So these products have certainly been proven through research to not actually be effective. And so don't use them. That being said, they have also been proven to actually slow down and sometimes even prevent closure. So not only do they not work, they've been proven to actually work in reverse. Now, there are sometimes times to actually use pruning paint, but it's not for the actual pruning cuts. It would be, for example, and the best of these products, I will say, don't help, but don't hurt. So they're sort of neutral. So why would you use them? You would use them for certain things. So, for example, oak wilt. Oak wilt is a really bad fungal pathogen that's attacking oak trees. And it comes to the oak tree by an insect. So the insect is looking for fresh wounds. So pruning cuts are fresh wounds. So if you painted those wounds with something that looked more natural, then you would camouflage that fresh wound from the insect that would help to spread oak wilt. Now, oaks, we really don't want to prune until it's dormant anyways, for the reason that the insect that's helping to spread oak wilt is not around. So the dormant season is probably the only time we really recommend pruning oaks, deadwood or livewood, for that matter. The same thing could be said for pitch mast borer, another insect that looks for wounds on pines. And if you paint those pruning cuts or paint those cuts, that you camouflage those fresh cuts from the insect. Again, not to help the tree seal. So there's a few reasons. On a dead branch here on the left, real easy to see the collar. Dead wood meets live wood, it makes a line. I mean, it doesn't get much simpler. You cut on the line, remove the weight, and then cut on the line. Close as you can to the collar without hitting it. Same thing is in place when the branch is alive. You just look for that sort of swollen area where the main branch hits the trunk, or when a smaller branch hits a main branch. And that's an example of a really good pruning cut. You can see the branch bark ridge on top perfectly maintained, and the collar is intact, really clean. As soon as you do that, it goes into an external response on the plant, and that's wound wood production. So you'll see if you make a good pruning cut, the entire wound is actually being sort of circled by wound wood, and that goal is to grow and seal the wound. So as time goes on, the wound wood continues to grow and gets bigger and more. I call them wound wood bagels or wound wood donuts. And eventually they close them right up. And when that happens, now no more energy goes to production of wound wood. That now goes back to vascular transport. So you, and one of my other hobbies besides hunting big trees is dissecting plants. We burn firewood, so every time I split a piece of wood, I'm analyzing it. And I've got, tons and tons of examples of things that I've split apart. But when you look at these cross sections of where a wound was being made, the vessels are not linear, like you think of normal vascular system of a tree. Xylem, phloem, cambium, all kind of linear. Wound wood's all kind of bundled up and it's trying to seal over. But once that wound wood closes that wound, the new layer of wood will now be vascular bundles. It will now go back up and become linear again. And externally, new bark is being put on from the cork cambium. So as time goes on, you can barely see that old wound anymore. Now it's become, new bark. But you can see that was at one point an old pruning cut.
How long would that process take?
It could take years for a big branch, and it could take a season for a small branch. So generally speaking, it's always better to take a branch off when it's small, as opposed to letting it get big. But sometimes we don't have that option. Storms make decisions for us, and failures make decisions for us, and fruit trees grow bigger than we often think they're going to get. So, but it does depend on the species, and it depends on how big the branch is. But it could take years and years. To give you an example, the oak tree at Landis Arboretum that was considered one of the oldest oaks in New York State prior to its demise in 2011 from Hurricane Irene, was estimated around 500 years old, and it had a giant branch taken off from an ice storm back in the 60s, 1961. And we know that because we're an arboretum and we keep records, which is one of the reasons why we're not just a pretty landscape. We actually, like you guys, an arboretum, we have all the data. We know where the tree came from, what happened over the years. And this one was an ice storm that took off a branch back in 61. And when it fell in 2011, that wound never closed. It was an incredible amount of wound wood all the way around it, and it never closed. So what happens to trees that don't close? Well, there's another process. So the external part of this is sealing. The internal part is compartmentalization. So we count on the tree having some ability to wall decay from spreading, but that also hinges on the fact that we need it to eventually close. And if it don't close, the walls of compartmentalization eventually fail. And we will talk a little bit more about compartmentalization coming up. But again, that was 1960 to 2011. The tree was still healthy, but it was structurally no longer solid. It became a hollow pipe. And then when 2011's Hurricane Irene winds came, it broke the tree right in half. Pretty much all of the living part landed on the field around it. And the main trunk is still there at the Arboretum today. It's sort of a memorial. And this is sort of what we look at. So this is, again, tree autopsy 101. But this is an old wound that the bark has been excavated away. And you can see the bundles now are all kind of linear. It's gone back to vascular tissue. This is why we do the undercut. You can see here, the branch, even if they lined up the collar perfectly, when they made that final cut, it damaged the collar underneath. So they didn't take the weight off. They didn't do the 3-point pruning cut. And now you've got a messed up collar. So what happens when you see the regrowth of that? Well, it looks like that. So now we have callus growth or wound wood around it, but not at the bottom, not where that collar was damaged. And here's another example of that. The two in the bottom, both of those have had damage to the bottom part of the collar. So you see the wound wood surrounding three sides of the injury, but nothing at the bottom. The two at the top are examples of good pruning cuts. And here's another example of a bad pruning cut, another substandard cut. So this one, they actually lined up the collar at the bottom, but they took away the branch bark ridge on top. So what kind of a wound response do we see to that? And we see wound wood being put on the bottom, nothing on the top. And now these wounds stay open. So just like the example of the old oak tree, now you've got rot that can get in. And the compartmentalization internally stops it, slows it. But as time goes on, if this wound don't close, eventually the walls of compartmentalization fail. And eventually, if you've ever seen a hollowed out tree, that's how a tree became hollow. It got hollow because the walls of compartmentalization failed from some old injury. And it could be a pruning cut, could be a storm, removed branch from Mother Nature. Here's a few more examples of substandard cuts. The one on the left, the branch bark ridge on top was cut too close. The collar on the bottom was cut too close, but they managed to get the collar to stay on both sides. So there you go. There's the wound wood production. And then the example on the right, I would say, is the best bad example, only because it actually has wound wood engulfing the wound. It just needs to be cut a little closer. So that one you can actually go back and trim a little bit closer if you needed to. But if you did nothing with it, that one on the right would close. So we talked about this compartmentalization of decay in trees coated. So this is what happens internally. Externally, we talked about the response and sealing. Internally, walled compartmentalization occurs to stop decay from spreading through my plant. And I won't get overly technical, but it basically stops decay from spreading inward, upward, radially around it, downward, and even outward. So now we take a look at a couple of examples here. So the one on the left, an injury made by a renegade lawn company. Someone swipes the side of your tree and takes a big chunk of the cambium off on one side. The one on the right is a professional pruning cut made by an arborist. And I say, which one do you think is worse? The one on the left from Renegade Landscape Joe, which is a bigger injury, or the one on the right made by a professional arborist, which is a smaller injury? Anybody think the one on the left is worse? Or the one on the right is worse? What do you think? The one on the left is actually better. So most people would think the one on the left is worse because it looks worse. And it's certainly not made by a professional, it's made by a sloppy lawn care guy. The reason why the one on the right is worse though, is because you actually, instead of just scraping, think about the vascular bundles in a tree. Instead of just scraping the external part of a vascular bundle, the one on the right actually severed all of those bundles, cut them all right and literally cross-sectioned them. And because of that, the responding wound wood response of that is going to be significantly different. So let's take a look at that. So here we are, the one on the right is the pruning cut, the one on the left is the renegade landscape guy that hit your tree with a mower deck. And as time goes on, this is discolored wood. The blue is discolored wood. So you can see, you got some decay or discolored wood happening on the right and left. Time goes on, one on the right, certainly a lot more. Time goes on, a lot more. Time goes on, a lot more. And that's all from a pruning cut, not the renegade landscape guy. Because again, the landscape guy's only scratching the outside surface of some vascular bundles. If he had went all the way around the tree and girdled it, that would be worse. That would be different. But in this case, it just hit one side. And on a young tree, that's going to respond like that. So when you see this, this is what we call discolored wood. It doesn't mean rot, but what it does mean is that backing up really quickly here. The external part of the tree, the part of the tree that's just under the bark, and just under the bark on all the branches is called the symplast, which is mostly all live cells. The inside of these trees is a combination of live cells and dead cells, and it's called apoplast. This will all be on the test at the end, so I hope you all take this. The apoplast is a lot of dead cells, but they're surrounded by live parenchyma cells, and in that area is where storage occurs. So the external part, the symplast, is where movement occurs. Think of them as our veins and arteries. But storage occurs in the apoplast, and because of that, anything that's discolored is no longer available for storage. So all these plants, woody plants, in the springtime after the long winter, they leaf out, and they didn't leaf out because they're photosynthesizing per se. They're leafing out because of all stored energy. So they get this stored energy from inside. You can think of almost kind of like batteries, and the energy comes out and it's used to put on the first set of leaves, and then it's counting on those leaves to those little solar panels to kind of start making food and keeping it alive. So the more discolored wood you have inside your plant, the less storage you have for overcoming injuries, from overcoming ice storms, from overcoming an insect attack that eats all the leaves up, and also just to be able to leaf out in the springtime. So the more, the less discolored wood we have in our plant, the better it is. That doesn't mean don't make pruning cuts. It just means understand this concept. And I'm going to show you a few things here when we talk about branch collars that changes this game. And it'll make you less afraid to maybe make a pruning cut. My goal is not to make you afraid to make a pruning cut. So just to back up and go back to why this one seems a lot worse, professional pruning cut, it's because of this right here. Think of, again, all those veins and arteries all running this way, and now you've cross-sectioned them all. And if the inside of the tree or shrub is more dead cells than live, a combination of live and dead cells, under a microscope, that looks like this. And basically, there's no way for those dead cells to really close themselves. So it's counting on the wound wood to grow over those cells and seal it. Now, I present to you something else that you may or may not have heard of. Odds are you didn't, but you might have. So we're talking about aspect ratio of branches now. So collars are not created equal. So if you look at the branch collar on the left and the branch collar on the right, the big difference is that the one on the left is a small branch compared to the trunk. The one on the right is a larger branch compared to the trunk. So the ratio of the branch to the trunk size is what we're talking about when I say aspect ratio. And the smaller the branch is in relation to the trunk, the stronger the branch protection zone is for that collar to hold. So when you make that cut, instead of that rock just going down through the tree like this, it's now held to that branch protection zone. And it only works on small aspect ratio branches. Doesn't mean small branches. It just means small branch compared to the size of the trunk. So if the branch is, the branch can be this big, but that means the trunk's got to be that big. It's got to be huge. And it would still be considered a small aspect ratio branch, and it would still have a strong branch protection zone. But most of the time, you're going to see trees that are looking more like the right, because we're dealing with urban trees, and we're not dealing with generally just naturally forest grown trees. And I'll tell you the difference between those two coming up in a minute. But anyways, the closer we get to A small aspect ratio, the stronger that branch protection zone is, and the larger it is, the weaker it is. So the more likely that rot can spread down through this colored wood and into the main stem of the plant. So here we go, some aspect ratio. So the one on the upper left would be the best of all of them because it is the smallest branch in relation to the trunk, and it would have the strongest branch protection zone in that collar region. The one on the right is weaker, and the ones on the bottom are what we call 1-to-1 aspect ratio. So the branches, the trunk now is split, and they're basically both the same size, and those are by far the weakest ones. And then the one on the with the red on the left, not only is that a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, but it also includes bark. So it has a bark inclusion as well. So that's the worst of all. And if you think about wood splitting, wood splits down the grain. So that one on those ones on the bottom, I mean, they're set up for failure. They're set up for splitting. The ones on the right are less set up for splitting, and the one on the very far upper left is the strongest. So let's take a look at how these smaller aspect ratio branches grow. And again, it doesn't mean small branch, it just means small in relation to the trunk. So the branch can be big, as long as the trunk is noticeably bigger. So when this type of growth occurs, we have an intermingling of the branch and the trunk wood. So the branch grows and then the trunk wood grows, and you can see that overlap occur like that. And that creates kind of like a real strong union. It mingles the wood fibers. And you can see that here. So what happens when a storm hits, let's say an ice storm hits, with a branch that's a small aspect ratio. You're looking at this tree right here, and you can see on the left-hand side, there's some broken branches. But this is after an ice storm. Where are the broken branches? They're outside of the collar. So fixing this tree is as simple as getting out my pruning saw and making a couple of cuts. The tree is completely healthy. None of the split migrated past the collar region. So it's created a very strong union, which is what we want to see. And trees that grow in forest conditions tend to do this naturally. So the certified arborist job in a nice woodland is a lot less work than it is in the managed woodland marshes, and also certainly a lot less work than the urban landscape. When we talk about the urban landscape or urban forest, that's a whole other animal, and that's what we're going to be getting into here in just a minute. Take a quick break from all that heavy stuff, just talk a little bit about pruning tools. So everything I'm doing with structural pruning, I'm predominantly using hand tools. So when I pull the old chainsaw out, which I do like to use, I'm not really doing structural pruning per se. I'm doing maintenance pruning. So let's say the big dead branch that is overhanging my garage. I'm not going to climb that with a little hand folding silky saw and whittle away at that branch. I'm going to go up with my chainsaw and take the weight off and then take the branch off. But if I'm doing that's again maintenance pruning. If I'm doing structural pruning, that means I'm actually trying to encourage good structure on younger trees. And those are generally used. My number one tool is a pair of pruners. I like Felco pruners. I don't get any kickbacks from telling you that yet, but I'm working on it. Been saying that for too many years. We got to figure out a better angle. I like Felco 11s. I've been using Felco 11s for a really long time. I won't get into all the models or what the differences are. This type of pruner we don't recommend. These all, it doesn't matter if it's Felco or not. The main thing is they cut like a scissor. So they have a bypass action. Whereas this one cuts what we call like an anvil. So it has a flat blade and comes down and pinches material. Really hard to make a good pruning cut with this. I only use them for examples of what not to use. I got a couple of my pruning arsenal just to show people. So not really too good. You want the one that cuts like a scissor. My next most used tool is a saw called razor tooth saw. I use a brand by a company called Silky. I do say once you go silky, you never go back. It's an unbelievable saw. You use them once, you'll see why. They're not that much more money than an inexpensive saw, but the cheaper the tool, it isn't always about the money, but the better the quality of the tool, the better quality you cut. If you give me a really cheap saw, it's hard for me to make a good pruning cut too. So I use this one. This is in my arsenal. That one's called the Sugai. It really don't matter the model, they make so many models now, all that really matters is their razor tooth designs, and if you run a good one, get a brand called Silky. This one here I have on the top, I use that one a lot as well, it's a folding saw, it's called Big Boy. I have a lot of those, the one on the bottom is called the Pocket Boy. And although it's a little too small for me, my wife loves it in the garden, so. Again, no kickbacks from Silky yet. These types of saws were used in the old days. If you got one of these, I'd say hang it in the garage for posterity. But don't use it for burning. And if you're actually, thinking about camping or backpacking, that's certainly not good for that either. I mean, that's way better. That's my go-to backpacking saw too. And then barrel hoppers, they're basically just like pruners with long handles. They let you go through larger material. And also, more importantly, reach things that you can't normally reach, which is important. So I do use a hopper quite a bit. And then this tool, also made by Silky, I absolutely hated any kind of pole pruner, any kind of pole saw for years. And part of that problem was I didn't get a Silky saw, so that made a huge difference. That being said, the Silky saw, pole saw combo that I use now has become one of my favorite tools. I use it more than I ever thought I ever would. It's just, and it comes in sections. You can go up to 3 sections, and I think up to almost 30 feet of cut. And but you can take them apart, and they're all aluminum. They're all lightweight. So I just tend to use the very top section with the saw more than I use anything else. It just gives me that extra reach for things that I just can't, too small of a tree to climb. And working from ladders, I've never really advocate working for ladders, especially if you're not roped in. I do use a lanyard, and I use a harness when I do use ladders, so I'm actually safety roped in. But up on a ladder, no ropes, one hand trying to hold the branch, the other one letting go and using the saw. I mean, I've had friends that landed on wrists and broke wrists. So if you are going to use ladders, rope yourself in. Otherwise, these tools save you the ladder. It's really handy. And then again, chainsaws, like I said, they're my last sort of tool in my arsenal. But I do use them, but again, not really for structural pruning. It's more for maintenance pruning. Branch got too big, it's going towards the house. Maybe it should have been structurally pruned years ago, but it wasn't. Now I gotta remove it. Chainsaw. But otherwise, all that structural work on young trees, which is pretty much the rest of this talk, at least the pruning segment, we're all going to be talking about younger tools, or I should say smaller tools. Get them from, I get most of my stuff from CherylTree.com, but you can get them from other places too. I do recommend using alcohol to sterilize tools between cuts. So when we do pruning cuts, if it's diseased wood, I sterilize it every single cut as I'm pruning through a tree. If it's healthy wood, then I just sterilize in between patients. So got finished with this tree, quick sterilization, go to the next tree. You'd expect the same from your dentist or doctor. Trees are no different. Pruning calendar, this is by no means definitive when you can't prune, but what it is, it's just good guideline. So good guideline is trees and shrubs that bloom on previous season's wood, and those are examples of what lilac, forsythia. Those are all pruned right after they bloom. Trees and shrubs that bloom on current wood, and those are examples of rose of Sharon, butterfly bush, edible apples. Those are all pruned prior to growth. That's why the orchard's all pruned end of winter, early spring, because it's pruning prior to growth. The growth's gonna occur, flower's gonna be formed, fruit's gonna be formed. Whereas a lilac, as soon as it gets done blooming, it's literally starting next year's flower buds and going into seed production. So if you deadhead, take away all the flower buds from the lilac, all the energy that would go to the lilac seed would actually go to flower bud production. So if you want to get more blooms, more flower power, deadheading your shrubs is worthwhile. In the old day, I used to say, to clarify, depending on the audience, I don't think that's a problem here, but deadheading doesn't mean taking your lilac to the Grateful Dead show. It means take the spent flowers off. There was some confusion in the past. I mentioned the dormant season, so that's a really good time to prune too. Summer is also a really good time to prune, so a lot of pruning I do at the Arboretum occurs in the middle of summer. And when I say middle of summer, I mean like middle of June to probably middle of August. Late season pruning can stimulate late season growth, so we don't really recommend pruning too late in the season. So like this time of year, I wouldn't do a real lot of pruning. But then I would wait till the dormant season occurs, and then I would go back to dormant pruning. Bleeders, things like sugar maples, any maple for that matter, birches, all of those plants, when they get an injury in the spring, think about maple sap production, maple syrup production, they bleed. So if you make a cut in the dormant season, in the spring, when the maple wakes up, it's gonna bleed a ton of sap. So we recommend pruning those in the middle of summer when the sap flow stops. So summer's really good. Oaks, because of oak wilt, now the only time we recommend pruning oaks are during the dormant season, specifically for oak wilt. Otherwise, they could have been pruned anytime. And then according to Dr. Alex Shigo, who is considered the father of modern arboriculture techniques, he always said, almost prune anytime except for these two times, when the leaves are actively coming out in the spring and the leaves are at the peak of dropping off in the fall, because there's a sort of a peak physiological functions and things that are happening within a plant. So it's best to avoid those two times. All right, so now we're going to talk about structural pruning and there are sort of two types of classifications of trees that we're going to focus on. X-current and D-current. And the ones we'll start with X-current first because they're really simple. So X-current trees basically produce a central leader, and no matter how old they get or how big they get, it's just one central leader. And since those are by far the easiest ones to talk about, we can cover that in like a minute or two. We'll start with those, and then everything else will be D-current. Now, examples of X-current plants are spruce, fir, pines. These are all examples of X-current plants. No matter how big they get, they always want to have one central terminal. So the only thing you really got to do with X-current plants is maintain a central leader. That's it. So in the case of this, where you lose a leader, which is common, white pine gets, white pine weevil comes in and kills the tip. Loggers hate them because they create less valuable lumber. And all you got to do is retrain that dead leader. So on the left-hand side, what I do is I take the dead leader and I cut it, but I leave a stub. And then I take a lateral branch and I bend it up and I tie it to that little stub, if you have a stub. In most cases you do. And I leave that there for maybe a couple of seasons, maybe a year. And then you come back in and you cut that little piece of tape, and then you can cut that little stub back off. And then you got a new leader. In most cases, you'll have more than one lateral. And in which case you have to remove the competing laterals. So you want to just train one up. So otherwise you end up with 2 or 3 branches from that central point. And now we have a structural defect and a failure point. So that's X-current trees in a nutshell. I mean, it's that simple. Train a new leader. The only other thing I sometimes do with X-current trees is we'll remove some of the bottom branches, and that's nothing to do with the tree. That's more for people. Because let's say the deer ate up all my lower branches on my conifer. All right, you could theoretically limb that up. Or if the branches are too low and it's getting in the way of a sidewalk. Otherwise, that's again not really for the tree. The leader is for the tree. And that's all you got to do for X-current. So that one's off the list. We're done. Now we go to D-current, which is unfortunately for all of us, the majority of everything we prune. Most things form rounded domes over time. That's what D-current means. It grows up as a central leader tree in a forest, and then when it breaks the canopy and gets light, it says, I'm at the top of the forest, and it spreads out, and it forms a rounded dome. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially in a forest, because in a forest, it's all shade-based, and the trees grow a perfect structure to get to the light. So an example of that would be here. So you can see these forest trees have all grown perfectly straight. There's not an arborist needed for any reason whatsoever in that forest. And then eventually they break the canopy and they say, I'm going to spread out. And that's completely fine. So if we're only managing D-current trees in a situation like this, it would be just as easy as the X-current trees. But when these shade tolerant plants break the sun and say, I'm gonna spread out, when that occurs when they're young in an urban landscape, in your backyard, and around this campus, all of a sudden, these trees think they're at the top of the forest, and they say, I'm gonna spread out. And now, us arborists have a full-time job. And here's why. So, two examples of liquid ambar sweet gum. The ones on the left are actually old growth sweet gum, and you can see they've got straight trunks, and then when they get to the top, they branch out. Same species on the right, newly planted, thinks it's at the top of the forest, and what's it gonna do? It's gonna branch out and start to spread out, and when it does that, really large limbs form. So we talked about that aspect ratio, small limbs compared to the trunk. When we look at this, we don't see too many large aspect ratio branches here. We see a lot of tiny branches compared to the trunk. But when we look at that example on the right, it's already getting on the larger side. And as time goes on, I'll show you kind of how this works. Starts out as a pretty good tree with a pretty good leader there in the white, but then those side branches, it thinks it's at the top of the forest and it's saying, we're gonna get aggressive, we're gonna spread out. And they wanna compete with that top, they wanna overtake that top. And by doing that, they get really large and the aspect ratio changes. So our goal is to kind of keep that aspect ratio smaller in a series of ways. So here we look at this tree grow out as time goes on. And of course, those branches have gotten larger. Some have been removed. Time goes more on, big branches get in the way, big branches start to get pulled down by a lot of weight, excessive weight. Again, weaker inclusions, the strong aspect ratio branches that are small, that's not happening here. So there's not an intermingling of wood and they want to split down the grain. And then as time goes on, you start to see trees that have big pruning cuts, which lead to more problems and eventually declines. And when you look at that branch on the right, that's a pretty big cut. I mean, that's into the heartwood of the tree. And you can see that this color in the middle, that's not actually bad, it's just the heartwood. But now that's gonna take a long time to close. Like you had asked before, how long does it take to close? This is years of growth here. Years of growth. Still not closed. And all that cracking and all that dry wood is just a perfect place for fungi to get into. And ultimately fungi get into trees and ultimately end up being part of the ultimate decline. And these are great entry points for that. So these big cuts not only create entry points for diseases and insects, but also they cause cambium decline. So if you look at the cut on the left, the big cut, and then the cut on the right, all of that decay that you see in that tree is all caused from that one big cut. And even the one on the right that has the sort of decay on the bottom, that's spread throughout that entire plant. And not all trees compartmentalize at the same way. Some trees are really good compartmentalizers while they decay to one area. Other trees are horrible at it. For an example of a really bad tree is a redbud. Redbuds are horrible compartmentalizers. So if you know that, obviously making smaller cuts is in your best interest. But even on good compartmentalizers, large cuts are just not good. Think about this colored wood that occurred in there. How much storage did we just lose from inside that tree because of that pruning cut? So large cuts not ideally recommended. And then if they don't have those types of things occur, the breakages are always high on the list of trees that have large aspect ratio branches. Typical passerby says this looks good, but when you get close to it, it actually shows large aspect ratio branches, 1-to-1, with inclusion on the right. That's bark against bark, and that never seals, never closes. And eventually it looked like this 6 years later. The average life of an urban tree is less than 10 years, which is ridiculous. But for a lot of reasons, and this is certainly one of those reasons. Compaction is another reason. That's a whole other talk, but compressing the soil and getting rid of pore space means roots can't have the air exchange that they need ultimately, and that ends up being a top-down decline symptom in the landscape. So between compaction and really bad pruning management, those are the main two reasons why urban tree lives less than a decade. When I say urban tree, it could be a country house and with no neighbors. That's still not the typical forest condition. You're still planting trees in open areas, and anything that's planted in an open area falls into these rules. And here's a 1-to-1 aspect ratio with included bark. You can see the bark of one touching bark of another, and then as that grows and gets big, you can see the rot that was inside there. Here in Tree Autopsy 101. And this isn't just for, giant trees, it works for shrubs too. So, here's on the left, a typical arborvitae, white cedar. When that was purchased, most likely, it looked like a conical plant, but really, if you had went inside the foliage, you would have seen 3 stems. And that obviously is a failure point. We want to see 1 stem. So when you buy these types of shrubs, definitely, I give you all permission to go into the nursery, dig into the foliage, and the guy asks you what you're looking for, you can tell him, Fred said, you're looking for 1 solid straight leader here, not 3. And it's so commonly sold like the left. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the last thing you want is these plants to break apart when they start to get good looking. My mom had some of those ones on the left as a kid. I remember she tied them together with some string, and that was pretty much all you can do with those. That's what we do with trees that have these problems. They're tied together as well, or they're removed. And only we use cabling and bracing and stuff for bigger trees, not just small string. And then you can see the shrubs on the right all split. And the last thing we want is a really nice shrub to split during the windstorm, during the snowstorm. So when we talk about structural pruning, that's the solution. And when we talk about structural pruning, we're talking about the structure coming up the stem as well as radially around the stem. Tree on the left is good structure, tree on the right is bad structure. So the tree on the left has good spacing with a single leader. Tree on the right has literally 5 branches. They look like they're all about the same size, all coming out of a central point. That's what we call a structural defect. If it has a target, like a garage, like a playground, like your driveway where you park your car, those are all considered hazard trees now. That doesn't mean you gotta take it down, but we gotta do something to mitigate the hazard, which, in a lot of cases, just cabling, some reduction in pruning. Tree on the left is good structure, tree on the right is bad structure. They both look about the same, but you can see the one on the left has a nice straight leader with smaller aspect ratio branches, and the tree on the right, a bunch of branches. They look like they're about the same size, all coming out of a central point. So right is bad, left is good. Left is what we're trying to make happen when we prune. Same thing here, tree on the left, it is decurrent, it has a rounded dome, but look at it, it's got a nice straight leader up to the point where it gets up towards the top, and then it spreads out a bit, and there it's okay. Trees on the right, bigger branches, lower on the stem, 1-to-1 aspect ratios, and failure points. Tree on the left, certainly a lot better structure than the tree on the right, but they look kind of similar. But we're going for the one on the right is going to break apart way before the one on the left. About over 90% of the trees that fail in landscapes, trees and shrubs that fail in landscapes are structurally defects. So if we can eliminate those structural defects, we can eliminate 90% of the failures in our landscapes just by structurally pruning. And this is not a one-stop shop. It's not like, oh, it's spring, I'm gonna do my structural pruning, I'm done, my young maple. No, you're not done. You got to do it every year for maybe a decade. But it's not a ton of work. A lot of times it's 1 cut, 2 cuts. I mean, imagine hiring me up, I come over to your house, Fred, can you prune my, my little row of 4 or 5 maple trees? And all I really see is a couple of codominants. So I go down the line, snip. Takes me 10 minutes, and I give you a $200 bill, and you're like, what? But the reality is, it took me 30 years of education and training to make those cuts in 5 minutes. And you don't need to be super skilled to get this either. You guys can do this at home. It's simple pruning. It's not that it's complex. It's just knowing what needs to be done. Not so complex. Actually, it's in a lot of cases easier than maintenance pruning. It's just understanding what we're after. So what we're not after, which is like this beautiful tree on the bottom part of the left property here. I mean, it's a big anchor plant. Is it beautiful? Yeah. Is it a structural defect? Yeah. Is it going to split apart? it is. And here's another example where that happened, big tree, anchor part, anchor of the landscape, rot inside. Luckily, it went this way, towards the road and not towards the house, but either way, now that tree is a takedown. You're not gonna be able to believe that. The science behind it says when a tree breaks like this, it's way more likely to break again. And it won't take as long for the second break. So, in most cases, something like that means a takedown. And so now you lost your plant and it cost you $3,000 to lose your plant. And whereas if that tree was actually, structurally correct, or if it was cable to prevent that failure, it would be adding value to your home, not costing you money. So we talked about how these big branches create problems. So let's take a look at how that occurs. So tree on the left, same shopping plaza. Tree on the left, bad structure. Tree on the right, relatively good form. Time goes on. Tree on the left, 8 years later, massive inclusions of bark, and certainly big aspect ratio branches. Tree on the right, still looking pretty good. 13 years later, the one on the left is pretty much gone. It's gonna be a takedown. Tree on the right, still holding pretty strong, because it had that good structure to start with. And the strategy for this is pretty much really simple. So I'll show you this in 3 basic steps. So first is, where's the leader? You can see that's number 1. 2, where's the competition? That's those branches that are looking to take over the top. They want to be as big as the main leader. And then where do we cut the competition? And with a light pruning dose, you would see in examples in the middle of a tree there. And with a more moderate or heavy pruning dose, you would see where you would make those cuts on the tree on the far right. Both examples are fine. I do tend to be a little bit more moderate with my pruning and a little bit less towards the light, only because I don't know if I'm coming back to the site next year. The customer may not call me back for 3 years, 4 years. So in some cases, it may be better to do more of the moderate pruning dose. But if it's your tree in your yard, or you're the arborist on site, you can certainly do less because you're coming back to it. Either way is not bad examples. It doesn't always mean that the branch has to be removed. We really are doing more and more as arborists with reduction cutting. So if you look at the bottom there, those are examples of how we would cut those branches back. And basically, a reduction cut is removing the larger part and retaining the smaller part. So in both cases there at the bottom, you can see, especially on the left-hand side, that's kind of what we're looking for. And it's also important to think about what branches we're releasing, because every time you make a pruning cut, we're releasing a branch somewhere else too. So if I'm taking a branch away from my, that's growing towards my window, but I'm cutting back to a smaller branch that is pointing towards my window, where's the new growth gonna go? Back towards the window. So you want to try to prune something that's maybe growing away from the window, growing in a favorable direction. And here we go. We have an example of young trees. Now, again, this is not rocket science, and this is not a real complex or hard technique. It's just understanding what we have to do to make this work. So, tree on the left, the young tree has a large aspect ratio branch. It's got a branch that almost looks as big as the top or the main leaf. So we cut the competition. In the middle, you can see where the cut was made. And then on the right, you can see that same cut, because remember, if the branch is here and you make the cut, as the tree grows taller, this branch is not growing up, it's staying right wherever it is. Tree gets taller, branch stays where it is. So 2 years later, you can see that pruning cut now. And you can see how much of an influence that made on that tree by one cut. And now 5 years after planting, look at that cut. So with the power of a single pruning cut, you could affect the entire tree. It would have been a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, and it would have had a structural defect. So it's not that it's so hard, it's that it's knowing what to do and knowing how to do it. So you can see that back from where we're beginning, and there's that cut 5 years later. If you don't do this, you just let it go, the tree turns into a big bush. And again, large aspect ratio branches, definitely branches lower than you want them, blocking signs, blocking roadways, blocking sidewalks, and excessive amount of weight on those branches, setting itself up to be a failure point. So back when I was in college, we used to learn to not really prune at the time of planting, and that's been changed since I graduated from college, a whole bunch of years ago. We now recommend pruning at the time of planting, and the reason for not pruning at the time of planting is that there was some science to say that it reduced establishment to some degree, and we will say that that may be the case, but not enough. It's too minor to worry about. So we're much more worried about the structure. So here, trees on the left were pruned at the time of planting. In other words, when I say pruned at the time of planting, we're not taking tons of branches. We're looking at structure, straight leader, straight up, eliminating those codominants that want to take over the top. That's what we're talking about. It's not, oh, I gotta make sure I tip this little piece off, and there's a little broken little twig here. I gotta make sure, like that stuff, I'm not even looking at that. I'm looking at stem up 1 liter, okay? This branch looks like it could compete with the top, reducing that or not. It's like 2-3 cuts sometimes. So trees on the right, not pruned at the time of planting. And they've all developed, and you can see, into multiple leader trees that are all gonna require work now. Whereas the ones on the left hardly require any work at all. And it starts with a nursery stock that looks good. This is a pretty good tree, looks pretty good, has a good leader, but it has some branches that are up there near the top that look like they want to sort of compete with that top. So same photo here, shrunk down a bit. Now looking at that tree several years later, that tree now, that little codominant turned into the one on the left. You can see what it was on the right. It was very small. We take a minute with a thumb pruner to snip. But now on the left, it's a pretty big 1-to-1 ratio, and that's only at first. So definitely pruning at the time of planting is recommended. You can see this here, how that kind of happens. A few more examples. Small trees, young, being pruned at the time of planting. Tree on the left, you can see it has a 1-to-1 aspect ratio branch developing. It's been solved by removing it on the tree on the right. Here, this tree, an example, has some damage. You can see an old damage mark of the main stem, but that side branch is certainly it wants to take over the top. So what do? In this case, because there's so much good closure happening on the main stem, I'm not too worried about the main stem because I know that's going to close. The wood's growing well. It's still got a lot of vigor, and it's a young tree. If that was a really old tree, we might have a different choice, but this is a young tree. So if this one's just cut that branch off, problem solved. And that wound will close. It's already well on its way. It's probably a year or two away from closure. Here's an example of a really bad one. 5 branches all coming out of a central point. This is kind of like the worst case scenario. But it's still young. It's still young enough to fix. So how do we do that? Well, here, let's give you an example. This is the tree, what it looks like with the 5 branches all coming out of a central point. And this is how it was solved. It was solved with 2 pruning cuts, or I should say 4 pruning cuts. Which now that tree, it looks similar, but it doesn't have no structural defects. And now it can grow into a tree that's going to be a lot better off in the landscape. And this occurs with even large trees. So this isn't just for young trees, it's for middle-aged trees too. So the tree on the left, you can see it started to get that codominant. It's got, 2 branches, it looks like, that are kind of competing height and size. So the arborist came up and topped one of them off, not topped, I hate to use that word, reduced one of them. And now on the right-hand side, you can see that it's smaller, but what also has occurred is that when you reduce that, you told the flow of hormones, which actually affect growth of trees, to no longer really favor that left limb and instead favor the middle section where you didn't prune it. So now the middle one grows bigger and the one on the left stays smaller. And as time goes on, the aspect ratio actually changes. So you're changing this aspect ratio over time. You can see how that's affected that tree over a year later. Know your limitations, know when to call an arborist. And like I said, don't recommend people getting up with ladders and doing all this stuff. So know your limitations. I'll just briefly mention tree topping. This is not the same as reduction pruning. Reduction pruning is cutting back to a lateral that's large enough to assume the role of the terminal, whereas these are cutting back the little tiny branches, haphazardly cut, and that's what we call tree mutilation. This is not going to close. There's no collars where these cuts were made, and in a lot of cases, this kills trees. But if it doesn't kill them, then it causes a really dangerous and unsightly kind of regrowth. You may have seen this. I'd like to say this was a thing of the past, but this is still unfortunately occurring. And this is an example of a cross section of an old topping wound on the right. And you can see no callus, no wound wood production, rot going down the main stem, and all of the wood, all of the good wood just on the outside peripherally stuck. So that's gonna peel right off with an ice storm, so not good. I just wanna mention shrubbery, just because I see this one a lot, so branching out into shrubs here a little bit. The main thing with shrubs are that you prune the bottom of the shrub is wider than the top. So think of this example here. If the bottom is wider than the top, then the bottom gets full sunlight. And if it gets full sunlight, it stays green. As opposed to the top being wider than base, like this. And if you've seen shrubs like this, where the top's just basically shading the bottom out, it creates this dead space on the bottom or thin growth on the bottom. So we want to think about keeping those tops shorter or less wide than the bottoms. The bottoms are wider, and that just gives you full growth all the way down to the bottom. All right, we're going to switch to these guys here, and let's talk about mulch. So the good, bad, the ugly. The main thing about this mulching is that we don't actually mulch up on the stems of plants. Called a sort of volcano mulch syndrome. So the evidence on the right there, the example on the right, it's buried the root flare. And if you look at the example on the left here, you can see the place where the trunk meets the roots. And that place needs to be free of mulch above ground and dry. It doesn't mean that rain can't get on it, but it means it can't be under constant moisture. And the reason for that is that the cells that have evolved over years on that root flare are designed to be basically at ground level or above. So they're not designed to be under constant moisture. The root cells underneath that branch, underneath that root flare, are root cells, and they're designed to be under more moisture. But if you put moisture on that root flare, where it's not wanting to be constantly wet, you're going to end up with problems. And everything from crown rot to girdling roots and other issues. So we always say now, the International Society of Arboriculture says to maintain a 1-inch mulch-free zone around all the stems of all your woody plants. Some people call it the mulch donut because it has more of a donut effect with a hole in the middle. For whatever reason, that one just doesn't. It isn't as clear to me as a 1-inch mulch-free zone, but it sounds a lot better, probably. And if anyone wants a mulch donut sticker, my wife has a few of those put out by New York State DEC because they're trying to get people to just understand that we don't want to mulch the root flares. It's as simple as that. And we want to mulch wide. And how tall, how thick do we make this mulch? So there is a diminishing return. So too little is not good, and too much is not good. So around 2.5 to 3 inches of mulch is pretty much a good recommendation. It's enough to suppress light and stop weed growth from occurring. And it's also enough to conserve moisture and regulate temperatures and fluctuations, etc. And how wide do you mulch? I mean, in theory, how wide do the roots how wide do the roots spread out from a typical tree? And the answer to that is 2 times the canopy spread minimum, sometimes 3 times. So if you can mulch out to the canopy spread, you're doing pretty good. If you can mulch twice that, it's even better. But I mean, it gets a little crazy. I mean, you don't even have any yard anymore. So how much do you mulch? As much as you can. Keeping it away from the trunk, pretty simple. And example on the top is good, example on the bottom is bad. And you can see the root flare. And you see this all the time at the one on the bottom all the time. Super centers near you, steward shops near you. I've been known to jump out of cars and scrape these away from time to time at different locations. I've never gotten in trouble for doing that yet. All right, so proper mulching helps to maintain. Why do we mulch? To maintain soil moisture, to control weeds. Insulating blanket regulates temperatures. It can improve soil aeration. It can actually help with improving soil structure. Good mulches. And can even help with improving some fertility. And certainly improve maintenance, facilitate maintenance and keep the renegade lawnmower guy away from the trunks and the weed whacker guys away from the trunks. And it certainly looks good too. And I like, it's been proven, so a lot of research as to what's the best mulch in the world. And it turns out that those free arborist chips that we get sometimes from people that are working on the sides of the roads they actually end up being the best mulches. And because they're actually less, and again, we're not gonna have enough time for this one, but just really briefly, I'll just say this: if you get those really awesome mulches that are really expensive and they're like black and they almost look like soil, and it's almost all organic. And it's almost all like more barky, kind of decomposed. Like I said, it's more soil. That is going to absorb a ton of water because it holds water because it's an organic particle. And the only way that the rain would get through this 3 inches of that black, thick, awesome, expensive mulch that looks like soil is it has to super saturate that mulch to the point where actually all the particles are so full it can't hold any more water, and then it'll release water to the root zone below it. Whereas if you got that cheap arborist chip that they're trying to find places to give it away for free, that is no longer, it's not all bark, it's actually more like wood. It's actually wood. If you think about the water that's going to absorb, nothing's getting really in that particle until it rots. So it's going to only go to the outside surface of that particle. It'll adsorb itself to the particle, adsorb as opposed to absorb. So therefore the rain comes in and it goes right through the particle and goes right into your root zone. Otherwise you have to super saturate those other mulches. So it's been tested through the ISA, all kinds of different mulches. And honestly, those wood chips, they tend to be the best. Some people say, well, what happens when we have what if it has a disease on that tree? It was taken down. And the answer to that is actually been, again, proven through research, is that there's so much good bacteria, so much good fungi in the soil that disease in that particle introduced to your site, there's no room for the bad guy to take hold. So it's not so much, oh, I got to worry about all of this. It's not going to really, I guess if it was a tree that died of Dutch elm disease and I was mulching maybe an elm tree, might be a little bit more leery, but otherwise it really don't make much of a difference. And over all the years, at the Arboretum, we only use those wood chips, and I've never had a tree decline because we used wood chips. Seen a lot of good growth. So, anyways, that's the gist of the mulching. So, the last part of this talk is going to be planting techniques. So there's 3 main ways that plants are installed, woody plants are installed. It's bare root on the left and containerized in the middle, balled and burlap on the right. And they all sort of fit into this diagram. They all need to be planted at the correct depth. I've, over the years of consulting and the years of plants I looked at, I've never seen a tree decline because it was planted too high. That root flare was above the soil around it. But I lost count years ago as to how many plants I've seen in decline because they were planted just a little bit too low or way too low. So if you have to err on one side or the other, definitely plant a little bit on the higher side as opposed to low. Low plants installed low, sit there. Now people will say, why didn't my tree grow? It's like 4 years because it's 2 inches too low. So it's going to sit there. Eventually it's going to decline. Eventually it's going to actually succumb to something else. And the insect will probably get the blame. But really the insect is actually secondary. The real cause was planted too low. So they all got to be planted at the right depth. And I always say, measure once or measure twice, dig once. And this is how I measure them. I like to think I'm pretty good at guesstimating the depths, but when I check them, I'm not always so good at guesstimating the depths. So, literally use a handle or a shovel, find that root flare, make sure the root flare is a little bit above ground level, and you're going to be a lot happier. Try not to overdig the hole in the first place, because if you overdig the hole in the first place, the plant will settle. Even if you pack it down pretty good, it's now undisturbed soil, and as time goes on, it's still going to settle. So you want to put the bottom of that plant, on all cases, on undisturbed soil in a perfect row. So we'll start with this ball and burlap one first. When we do ball and burlap, we do remove the material that is recommended, but we never remove the material at the expense of breaking the ball. And the way that we do that is we dig the hole, we make sure it's measured, we know it's the right depth. And then I make, I get a pair of cheap bolt cutters, which don't work well on blocks, but they work really well on this galvanized metal that these cages are made from, which is designed to not rot. If you see a tree 20 years after it's been installed, and it's been installed with that basket's still there. It's designed to definitely not rot. 20 years, no problem in the soil. So that metal is not going nowhere. So getting it off is always, like I say, a good recommendation. But the way we do it is I make a cut across the bottom of that root ball. So I cut the metal that's on the bottom, and that's it. Leave everything else intact. And I roll that ball into the hole, get it situated right side, facing the right way, make sure it's not leaning. And only when it's perfect do I take those bolt cutters and I cut through the rest of that metal, and then it just peels right off like an onion, or an apple, just peels right off. And then I take my old trusty knife and remove the burlap. If you do leave some burlap on the bottom of that ball, you're fine. That's definitely not an issue. And then you want to backfill. Again, root flare right at ground level. And water it in. And when I backfill, we generally use whatever soil comes out. A lot of people over the years, they want to I see clay, compacted soil. So what's the first thing you think? Well, good compost. Let's fill that hole up with really good soil. Which sounds good and it works well for the first few years of the tree's life, but you basically just created a container for that tree. Roots are opportunistic, they're gonna grow, there's an opportunity. So there's an opportunity, rocky, clay, hard soil, or stay in this hole with really nice organics. It's gonna stay in that hole, but now you created an in-ground pot, and the roots, for it to be effective, you need to spread out like the spokes of a bike wheel. So if you think of that tree's trunk as the hub of the bike wheel, and all the spokes of the roots, that's what we need that to sort of do. So when we plant trees, and if it's a rocky clay soil, which is pretty much all we have at Landis, we dig wide holes. They're never any deeper than the tree's the correct planting depth, but they're wide, 3 times the width. And you're not talking about deep holes, because most of the holes are dug way too deep anyways. So we're talking shallow holes, but we loosen that soil out all the way around, and then we put it all back in. And if you have to amend, you can amend a little bit, but we say never more than like 20% of the total volume to be amended. We usually generally try to put everything back in. The only time we ever amend at all at Landis is if we just, we're running a little low on this one because it was a big rock in there. So now we need a little bit more soil. So we'll get soil out of our soil pile and bring it down, as opposed to bringing in tons of rich organic matter. If it's super, super sandy site, amending 20% is not a bad recommendation, because the roots will have additional water in that zone, and they still will spread out into the surrounding site. Sandy sites generally are drier and so less worried about compaction. And then water it in really, really well. And then containerized plants, the next one on our list, same concepts, planting at the correct depth and all that. But containerized plants present another set of problems. They grow in containers, and they tend to have these types of what we call root dysfunctions develop, because they hit the sides of the containers and they wrap around. So back when I was in college, I was taught to scarify the roots, which means to basically sort of trim a little bit here or there and kind of tease them out and fluff them out a little bit. And the research shows over years now that those teased out roots, you didn't really get rid of the root dysfunction. Did you help it a little bit? Yeah, but you didn't really get rid of the root dysfunction. So we still have root dysfunction happening. When you plant a tree like this, you end up with a tree like this. The roots don't straighten out. So we have to correct that problem. So now, if you have roots like this, the ISA recommends no longer scarifying roots. They recommend actually taking a crosscut saw and sawing off the outside inch or so of that root zone. And that's what we do at the Arboretum. When we see a tree like this, we saw the roots off. This is also my disclaimer, should you actually take a saw to your roots and anything goes wrong. This is not Fred's recommendation, this is the ISA recommending that you cut your roots off with a saw. So that gets me out of trouble as well. But all jokes aside, this is definitely a very effective way to do it, because if you think of the root having a bend and you tease it out, it's still got a bend. If you cut it off, everything that grows out straight, like the spokes of the wheel. So you corrected this root dysfunction. And this starts early on. So, tree on my far right, is the only one that's really free from root dysfunction at this stage of the game. The one next to it is already starting to get back roots up and down. And then anything else beyond that is pretty much not looking too good, so not what we wanna do. So, sort of starts with the container on the left, and when you plant those, they end up looking like the trees on the right. And what does that equal for you long term? A declining plant, that's gonna have a top decline. What's wrong with my tree? Call Joe's Tree Service up, they give it a bunch of nitrogen. It greens up a little bit for a month or two, then it looks even worse, and eventually it dies. And, an insect gets the blame, or a fungus gets the blame. But really, it's, root dysfunction. This is, I call it the underground epidemic, killing a lot of our trees and shrubs. So the tree on the right, or top, I should say, is what we're looking for, a nice straight, good root flare. And the tree on the bottom is certainly not what we want to see. It's got a girdling root. And that's just one girdling root, but if you see one, more than likely you got more than one. So that's actually, so you might say, well, why do they grow those plants in those containers to begin with? And the reason is actually, it's old technology. It's not state of the art. It's not the current industry trade. The current industry trade is all growing things in what we call air pots. So this is what we grow things at Landis Arboretum in. We've been trying to expand our Landis growing offerings for our plant sales. And we're doing more and more, introducing more and more people to these air pots. And this is, again, it may be new to you guys. It's easily a decade of this going in the industry, probably more than that. And they're not too expensive to buy, so there's no real reason not to have them. But what's beautiful about them is they create root ready plants. You dig a hole, you get the depth right, you stick it in, and the amount of root fibers that you have, root hairs in here, is incredible, way more than any of the other ones. So these plants take off running. So I'll give you an example here. So the one on the left, of course, grown in an air pot, the one on the right, not grown in an air pot. And you can look at you kind of clean off those balls a little bit. I mean, look at the amount of root hairs in there. When we sell these, when we plant these, they just take off. There's no delay. Super duper plants grown in air containers. And the way these air containers work is that they're designed with holes to actually guide, and insides of these containers are designed in such a way that the root hairs hit the plastic and it's guided right to a hole. And when a root hair gets near the hole, it dries out. And when it dries out, it dies, and it tells the root system to send out more root hairs. So you get more and more root hairs. None of them girdling, all of them actively feeding that plant, ready to go. So you can see that here, the root hair grows out to the air hole, and then it dries and dies, and then it resprouts, and does it again, resprouts, and starts to look really, really fibrous. These are the kind of plants that are certainly worth more money, and certainly worth your time trying to find them if you can get them in landscapes. And the last one is probably my favorite way to plant, although it has some issues with it. You can only get bare roots at certain times of year. You can only handle them during certain times of year, and you have to be picky on how you handle them. But other than that, I like it because you see the root system. So here's the root system. If it's got a girdling root, you're going to see it. It's not, these bare root trees are not grown in containers, and they're not balled in burlap. They're grown in the field. They're dug up when they're dormant, and they have full intact root systems in place. So these are good to go. You match the grade surrounding, same thing. Make sure your grade's matched and backfill it, and away you go. So that's the main three ways that we plant woody plants nowadays. I'm going to end this here in just a minute, but I did want to just touch on this one. I do a lot with WAMC on NPR. Anybody listen to NPR or tune into the Boxbaum Gardening Show? Awesome. We get a lot of questions about this on the air, so I figured this is a good one, kind of just to throw it in. When you create beds, you don't always have to dig everything out. So you can smother those beds and then later take away the smothering and plant them. So when I do gardening, we don't dig the gardens up anymore. I used to for years and years and years. Rototilled really, really fine. But the more you know about soils, the less this makes sense. So when we set up gardens nowadays, we basically just use weed fabric and we cover it. And I don't use weed fabric for any landscapes. Weed fabric's hard, and I get another 20-minute talk right there with all the things wrong with weed factor. But, so not good for landscapes, not really good for much of other things, but it's great for smothering weeds. And, in this case, on the bottom, that's the way I would smother a new garden. And I would do it a few months before I want to plant it, and then I would take it all away, everything that was there is all dead. And it becomes organic matter, and you can, right in there, you could top dress that if you wanted to with compost, and you can use a shovel and kind of fold it under, but we're not talking about that rototiller. That rototiller just, again, this is not soils talk per se, but the rototiller, the more you know about soils, the less our rototiller makes sense. Maybe next time I come back, we'll do a soils talk here. It's a dry subject, so helps if you have a sense of humanness for this one. All right, the last thing I'll say is that, before you plant, check your pHs. pHs of soil vary a lot. It's nice to know where, if you're gonna do a new garden, or you're gonna put some plants in your landscape, get a pH tested. Whether you do it yourself, or whether you take it to a cooperative extension, or send it out to Cornell University, get a soil test. Most plants like a 6.5 pH, and that's the reason. The reason is that these nutrients are not deficient. It's actually, if you look at the 6.5, they're just not locked up. So the same nutrient level in the soil, just when it gets to be a certain pH, it's no longer available. So you could, if I had an iron deficiency and I had a pH that was like a 7.5, I'm getting a lot less iron. So you would think, well, it's iron deficiency. If you recognize it as an iron deficiency, you add more iron, right? The deficiency doesn't go away. What happens? Next thing you know, you're locking up other elements. So really what we needed to do is add a little sulfur and drop the pH a little bit. And all of a sudden the iron deficiency goes away. Because now it's available. It wasn't that it wasn't there. It was that it's locked up. So pH test can't tell you enough about it. I guess that pretty much will wrap up this presentation for today. And I'll take it over for questions and answers. So trees on the left here are poplar trees, and the trees on the right are not very poplar trees. They do say it's better to be honest than poplar. I'm branching out a little bit with some humor. So I think on that note, like I said, these jokes aren't getting any better. We'll leave it at that and take some questions and answers, folks. Thank you all. Any questions? Right there.
First of all, thank you for explaining why that 110-foot tree fell on my house in June.
Yep.
Tornado that had 2 liters and it had.
And a tornado gotcha?
We had cable, but really hadn't kept an eye.
I can relate to the tornado story, but I also had a tornado hit our house, so.
Yeah.
We're actually currently still out of our house, but we're working towards getting back in.
Mine's been under construction.
Yep.
The one question I had is, as they were taking that tree off the house, they hit the ornamental tree, and so they have broken branches.
Okay.
We've been trying to preserve them. Hydrangea, beautiful flowering tree. The cambium is still intact, and we have been trying to hold it back together using bungee cord.
Yep.
Will that thing heal eventually?
Most likely,
Together, like a flint.
it most likely won't fuse. My mom had done that sort of thing to plants for years. She had a thing growing up called the plant hospital. Plants, and I got into the landscape industry, I started, tearing things out of people's landscapes, and she'd be like, what's wrong with that? I'm like, well, she'd taken and babied along for years, and sometimes she's got most of them to come back, I will say. But those ones that I saw her trying to fuse, the best you're gonna get is that both of them stay functioning, and then more good wood is put on. And then sometimes it gets more strength as it gets more good wood, but for them to completely fuse, not too likely. It is possible though, there's always that exception in nature, so.
But it's amazing that it's still alive.
Yeah, because it still has the cambium, so it's really just trying to keep it from splitting. So combination of, maybe some, it's more of an engineering problem now. You could maybe use some kind of bracing and some.
Oh, we've done all that.
Yeah, but I don't, most likely won't fuse. Yeah. Any other questions?
When is your tree sale?
We always have, we do it 2 times a year, so the weekend after Mother's Day in the spring and the weekend after Labor Day in the fall. And that's been ongoing since this next year is 75th anniversary of Landis Arboretum, so 75th anniversary of having tree sales too. It's our founder started it the first year that we were incorporated.
Now, and my question's about mulch. Can you use natural things like leaves and pine cones to mulch around plants?
You can,
I do it. I was wondering if it was a good idea.
yeah, you can. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what happens in the woods, and that's why those bark chips are often better than all that really heavy duty, all like really almost soil like organic mulch that costs a lot more. And because when you think about what happens in nature, the leaves are falling, the twigs are falling, the cones are falling, and branches are falling.
Sure.
And you've got a mix of all of that in there, but you don't see just a big thick pile of soil falling. And that's kind of what we're doing with these landscapes. And so the wood chip is actually closer to what happens in a forest, which is why it works better. It's by the time it breaks down, it's being incorporated into the soil and not so much as a barrier.
Also with that big tree coming down, it ended up with fortunately truckloads of that good stuff you're talking about. Is there any benefit in letting it break down a bit, or is it okay to put it immediately?
So good question. So Mythbusters here, I'm gonna start another one in the future as a good one. Just various Mythbusters of landscape things and tested by research. So one of those Mythbusters is that people over the years have said, these raw wood chips, when they break down, they take nitrogen from my soil. And we've heard that because actually in decomposition, the wood chip is going to use nitrogen. But there's so much nitrogen in the above ground air, it's not actually going to be pulling up from the ground like a sponge. So it's completely fine to use fresh raw wood chips around your trees and shrubs. If you let it age a little bit, there's no problem with that either. They'll take a while to break down, so they're good for many years, many years. But if you do, again, put raw ones right around your trees and shrubs, contrary to what a lot of people think, it's not taking nitrogen from the soil. Now, if you mix those wood chips into the soil, it might be more apt to take some of that nitrogen, but we're not really mixing it into the soil as a mulch. So I don't use those in my veggie gardens, but I do use that in many of the trees and shrubs that we plant in the landscape, because it's not really mixing into the soil. Even if it sits on the surface, it's not pulling it up from the soil. It's got more than enough nitrogen around it for that. That's not the same as sawdust though. Sawdust is different, so not sawdust, because sawdust is small enough of a particle that it could get mixed into the soil profile. And in that case, it could take nitrogen.
Thank you.
How concerned would you be for using the wood chips off of a black walnut to mulch with? Is it like a juggling content?
Yeah, so I wouldn't be very concerned, and there's been a research into black walnut stuff too. So another good question though. So black walnuts, for those of you that are not familiar with what he's talking about, is that they release juglone, which is a chemical to sort of eliminate competition around black walnuts. So in a nursery trade, if you've got a black walnut small tree in a container and you put little seedlings in that container, those little seedlings would not do too well. They'd probably perish in that container. But when you take an actual black walnut into the landscape and we think about it releasing juglones and killing competition, what we've actually found over the years of research is that it's not releasing enough juglones to really wipe out plants. What's actually happening is that we found out that these black walnuts are water guzzlers. So if you look at what plants will do good under my black walnut on the internet, you'll find that most of the plants that are listed are drought tolerant plants. They can tolerate drought. So yes, is it releasing juglones? Yes. Is it actually killing all the plants around my big walnut tree? No, it's probably robbing the water more than it is anything else. And that's what's actually making things not do so well around my black walnut. So in terms of using the black walnut mulch, chips, I wouldn't worry about, no, not enough to be a factor. Guys, ready for the big quiz? No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all. If you have other questions, hit me up. I have my wife back there, my right hand woman, she's got cards. She also has a little donut mulch stickers for you too, if you want. Again, come visit us. Thanks again. Nice thing.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
thank you, Fred, appreciate it very much, great talk, I learned a ton, and I have a newfound respect for all the work that certified arborists like Nick here have to deal with on campus, so.
Perfect.
Just a reminder, November 1st is our next events, and thank you for your time and attention today, enjoy the rest of your weekend, everybody.
Take care, y'all. My pleasure. If anyone does want a card, my cards are here. Do the multiple on stickers. What's the name of these? Now? I can't remember. I don't. Oh.